All right, so now let's talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So here you can see, hopefully these look familiar to you. This guy right here, remember, is let me go ahead and write that down right here. This guy right here, remember, is the mitochondria. Move this up a little bit right here. And then hopefully this guy down here looks familiar. And remember this one right here, this organelle. So this organelle is a mitochondria. This organelle right here is the chloroplast. Whoops. Chloroplast. All right. And so we're going to focus on these organelles today because, as you're going to learn, whenever you're talking about mitochondria, you're talking about cellular respiration, right? So, cellular respiration takes place in the mitochondria, and then photosynthesis right here takes place in the chloroplast. All right. And so, you'll see how they're connected right here. There's this image, and you'll see what this is and why that's important. And then just know again that if something is green, that is most likely because it has chloroplast in it and it can photosynthesize. Right, so let me shrink this down. So, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, right? They are vital chemical reactions which work together in a cycle and they keep organisms alive on Earth, right? And it's really cool how they are connected together. And remember, while we're talking about this, that plants have both a chloroplast right here and a mitochondria. Unfortunately for us, we only have this mitochondria right here, so we can only do half of this right here, right? We only do cellular respiration, but plants can do photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So, also what's cool about this is the products of one reaction are the reactants of the other product, right? So basically, remember the reactants are what goes into a chemical reaction. The products are what come out of the chemical reaction. But as you can see right here, and let me kind of walk you through this. So light energy comes from, well, this energy comes from the sun. Remember that is one of the laws of thermodynamics is that we cannot create or destroy energy here on Earth. All the energy we have originates from the sun, and we can only change it from one form to another. Right, so this light energy right here hits the chloroplast, and the chloroplasts undergo photosynthesis. Right, so the inputs right here are the sun, CO2, and water. Right, and if you think about it, this is what plants use. Right, they need sunlight and they need water, and they do take in the CO2, which is that gas that we as humans or as animals we breathe out. Right, so these are the reactants right here. They are going in. They are the inputs of photosynthesis. And then the chloroplast is here, photosynthesis occurs, and then what comes out of that, which is good for us, is this glucose right here. Right, we definitely need this glucose to stay alive, and it's not bad that it releases this oxygen too, right? Because that's what we breathe. And so you see again, the light, CO2, water come in and they come out right here as products. But if you look at this right here, this is cellular respiration. So it takes in these right here. So the inputs for mitochondria are oxygen and glucose. And remember, y'all, we have this mitochondria, which makes sense, right? Because we breathe in oxygen and we need to eat this glucose, right? And what we release here is H2O or water and CO2. And so then the chloroplast takes that in and it uses that. So you can see right here what they mean by the products of one reaction are the reactants of the other reaction, and the reactants of one reaction are the products of. So it's confusing, but basically it means what one of them releases, the other one takes in, and then that one releases that, and the other one takes that in, right? So that's what they're talking about here. So, what is photosynthesis? It's an endothermic reaction. Now, remember, when we talk about endothermic reactions, that means they basically absorb energy from around them and use it in that reaction. And so, it's a chemical reaction in which light energy is converted into chemical energy, right? And we saw that right here. This light energy right here coming from the sun is turned into this glucose right here, which is that chemical energy. And so, endothermic reactions store energy in the bonds of the product molecules. So the product right here, photosynthesis, is glucose. And what they're talking about is that there is chemical energy stored within this glucose. And that's why if you're not feeling very energetic, you haven't eaten in a while, you're super, super hungry, and then you take a bite of something that's got glucose in it, right? Some kind of food product, you eat that, and then you start to feel some energy, right? You feel a little bit better. You can actually move around. And so that is because, again, they store that energy in the bonds of the product molecules. In this case, and let me circle this right here, these product molecules, they are talking about this right here. right? So this right here, C6H12O6, let me write that right beneath here. This is actually glucose. Let me put this here. And so endothermic reactions store energy in the bonds of the product molecules. Again, that product in this case is glucose, and there is energy in that glucose. And that's why when you eat something and you're hungry and you're very, what they call lethargic, right? You really don't want to move around or do anything. Once you eat that, you get energy, you're able to move around, right? So here are the reactants. And let me just kind of label these for you right here. This CO2 is carbon dioxide. This thing is very off today. And so that is carbon dioxide, CO2. And let me just put this right here underneath, kind of move it off to the side. Yeah, and whenever you see this big number in front of the CO2, it just means there are 6 molecules of CO2, right? And hopefully you all know what this guy is right here, H2O. This is water. And so let me put this right here. And so how many molecules of water do you see here? 6 molecules of H2O, right? And then this light energy, we saw this right here. In the previous slide, right? We saw that light energy going in. And then the outcomes right here, the outputs right here, or the products are glucose. And then over here, this is oxygen. Yeah, so what you're going to see, what's really cool is when we talk about cellular respiration, this is basically going to be flipped. We're going to have the glucose and the oxygen on the left side of this arrow, and you're going to have carbon dioxide and water on the right side of the arrow. But for now, remember, this is photosynthesis. Plants take in CO2, they take in water, they take in light energy, and then they turn that into glucose, and then they release oxygen. And so we're still talking about photosynthesis as an endothermic reaction. So photosynthesis stores the sun's energy in the carbon to carbon bonds of glucose. Right. So here you see where those bonds are. That's where the energy is. And so it's really cool, y'all, just to think about how a plant can actually turn sunlight into sugars. I know we take that for granted, but it really is a cool process. The sun's energy is light energy. And the glucose formed during the photosynthesis is chemical energy. So again, we're changing one form of energy to another, sunlight energy or light energy into chemical energy. In the process, solar energy is absorbed to produce glucose and oxygen from carbon dioxide and water. And so this is what we saw right here, right? That carbon dioxide, that water, that light, they go into the reaction. What we get on the other side is glucose and oxygen. In the process, solar energy is absorbed. And remember, y'all, that's what an endothermic reaction does. It absorbs energy, right? So if you've ever mixed vinegar and baking soda in a glass container and you feel that glass, it's actually cold to the touch because that is an endothermic reaction. That reaction is sucking up all that heat or energy. Whenever you think of heat, you can think of it as energy, right? And it is absorbing all that heat. That's why it gets cold in that glass because it is an endothermic reaction. So where does it take place, right? Photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast, right? Hopefully this looks familiar right here. We talked about it recently. Photosynthesis takes place in photosynthetic bacteria. So if you hear of something called cyanobacteria, it usually has chloroplast in there. And if you look at it through a microscope, you can see that those green organelles there. Right? And organisms who have chloroplast are going to photosynthesize. And unfortunately for us, we don't have these, so we can't make food out of sunlight. But inside the chloroplast, the first steps of photosynthesis take place within the thylakoid. Right. So each one of these little things right here, if you want to look at them as like pancakes, each little pancake is called a thylakoid, right? But if you see a whole stack of them, it's called a granum. One stack is a granum. Multiple stacks like this, one, two, three, four, they would be called a grana, right? And so it takes place, like it says right here, in the thylakoid and the chloroplast stroma. The stroma, you can kind of think of it as kind of like the cytoplasm inside of the cell. That's kind of what the stroma is here for this chloroplast. Then you see the ribosomes. Remember, those little ribosomes make proteins. This cDNA, this is actually the chloroplast's own DNA. Remember, we talked about mitochondria having its DNA, its own DNA separate from the nucleus. And also, these chloroplasts have their own DNA separate from the nucleus. There was thought again that at one point these were their own little cell, which got eaten by a larger cell. So that's why that's one of the reasons why they believe that is because this guy has its own DNA. All right, and then you see the outer membrane out here, and then the inner membrane is what makes all of these little pancake thylakoid looking things and these stacks called grana. But yeah, that is where photosynthesis takes place in the thylakoid is where it starts. Which organisms perform photosynthesis? Pretty much anything that is green is going to produce its own food with sunlight, right? So autotrophic producers, photosynthetic bacteria, plants, photosynthetic protists, diatoms, plankton, algae. Again, if it's green, it's got chloroplast and it makes food from sunlight, right? It makes glucose, chemical glucose out of light energy from the sun. So autotrophs producers, kind of the same thing. They are two different names, but they basically mean the same thing. Organisms who can harness light energy and create stored chemical energy. So again, sunlight into glucose. And producer, basically the same thing, right? Organisms who can harness that light energy and turn it into a chemical form of energy, which is glucose. Right. And so this is kind of that overview of photosynthesis. Remember, photosynthesis is the first step in converting the sun's light energy into chemical energy, which is a glucose. And it can be used by organisms, right? So without that, we would not be here as animals because we would have no way to convert that sunlight energy into chemical energy because we don't have those chloroplasts. Right? Photosynthesis is performed by the autotrophic producers in the food chain. And we learned about this at the beginning of the term. The producers are down here at the bottom of the pyramid, but they are very close to, they have those really high amounts of energy. And as you go up this pyramid, then you see that energy is lost from 100% to 10% to 1% to 0.1%. Energy is lost as heat all the way up this pyramid, right? So very inefficient for us up here, probably up the tertiary consumers, but they do get a lot out of that sunlight and it kind of gets filtered out as it goes up the pyramid, this food chain. So the products of photosynthesis are not only used as energy for the consumers, right? And we're consumers. So we use that photosynthesis. We use that photosynthesis, right, to feed ourselves through plants. But the producers also use a glucose to make ATP by cellular respiration. So we talked about ATP a few lessons ago, or the last lesson that we did, and that's adenosine triphosphate. Whenever I think of triphosphate, I always kind of just think of this right here. Let me see. Hopefully, I can draw that without getting too messy with my drawing. So adenosine triphosphate, always really think of it like this. And let me just put this right here. And so these are phosphates right here. There's one phosphate, there's two phosphates, here are three phosphates. So remember, triphosphate means three. And so here you have one, two, three phosphates, right? So whenever it has this, you have these three, it's got energy in it. It's ready to be used. And once something, and it happens during cellular respiration, right? So we convert that glucose into ATP. So all right, it's going from the sunlight to the glucose and now to ATP. Like it says right here, let's see. Cellular respiration to have energy to grow, reproduce, and live. When primary consumers eat producers, so when animals eat grass, cellular respiration breaks down the glucose molecules in order to release the energy stored in the carbon bonds. So basically, again, all it's saying is it's going from sunlight to glucose and now to this guy ATP. And so whenever we use this right here, whenever we're using energy, and I was trying to point out, I think it says it later in the slides, it's a currency of living things, right? So if you want to do anything, any type of thing that a living thing does, even if it's breathe or blink your eyes, you're going to use ATP right here. And what happens is this ATP breaks down and energy is released from when you break this bond right here. Energy is released right here. So this is kind of like my energy just being released. And then you're able to move and do things that you couldn't do if you didn't have that ATP. Right. So, what is cellular respiration? We've been talking about photosynthesis, right? But now we're talking about cellular respiration. And again, we do not do photosynthesis, but we do cellular respiration, right? Or like it says right here, aerobic respiration. Basically, you need oxygen for this to happen, right? If you think of aerobics, any type of aerobic exercise, you need a lot of oxygen to do those things. And so, this is what it's saying right here aerobic respiration requires oxygen. So, the photosynthesis we're learning about is endothermic, right? But here you see this is exothermic. An exothermic chemical reaction in which chemical energy is converted into ATP. And so we saw that, right? We're turning glucose into ATP, kinetic and heat energy by all life forms. So exothermic reactions release the energy from the chemical bonds of molecules. I know it's a little bit confusing, but remember, endothermic was creating, and let me go right here back to this slide, the ways back. So endothermic right here was creating, it was sucking up energy so that it could put all that energy right here. What we're talking about now in cellular respiration, it's doing the reverse of that, right? So let me go back to this. So right here, it's kind of doing the reverse of that. It is releasing that energy right here. And so it breaks it down, and these exothermic reactions release the energy from the chemical bonds of the molecules. So that is what is happening here. And like I said, it's a reverse of photosynthesis, right? So right here, remember photosynthesis had the glucose over here, but in cellular respiration, this is where the glucose is right here. Again, it's just kind of the reverse of photosynthesis. Then you have O2. O2 is just oxygen, right? You have the O. Again, there are 6 molecules of oxygen. Then here you have, and let me just put it underneath it. Whoops, carbon dioxide. Here you have water, right? H2O. And then the very important part that you have right here, remember, this is that ATP energy. And so this, and let me try to do it this way really quickly. This is adenosine. Whoops. Yeah. 1 second. Let me just get this back here. Expand this a little bit. And so what I'm trying to draw right here is a triphosphate. And it's not going to work. So yeah, let's just forget about that. But the PPP right there, that is a triphosphate. That is that ATP energy. Right. So why is cellular respiration an exothermic chemical reaction? And cellular respiration, it breaks the bonds of glucose, right? So we break those down, and that's what's important to remember. If it's endothermic, you're basically building up. If it's exothermic, you are breaking down. So cellular respiration breaks the bonds of glucose, and right here you see this glucose right here, C6H12O6 is all right here, and it is releasing that energy to be used by the organism. So the energy released from glucose is used to produce ATP, the energy currency of all life. And that's where I was looking for earlier, currency. Right? Currency means money right here. So if you're ever thinking about ATP, you can kind of think of it like this. Right? ATP, if you need to do anything, you need to pay in ATP. Right? So even if you're just taking a breath of air, you need some ATP. You're blinking your eyes, you need some ATP. Right? So all of that stuff comes from cellular respiration, which we could not do without glucose. Right? So be very thankful for the plants that we have here on Earth, because without them, we would not be around. So where does this take place? Remember, photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast, but cellular respiration is going to take place right here in the mitochondria. The first step is glycolysis, which starts in the cytoplasm. So remember, y'all, whenever you see this right here, these letters GLYC, it's safe to assume that there is a sugar somewhere involved, right? And that's what's happening here. Glucose is a sugar. And remember, if something ends in OSE, it is a sugar. Lactose, fructose, galactose, glucose. Right. So the products of glycolysis then enter the mitochondria to complete the reaction. So unfortunately, in this class, we do not have enough time, because it's an accelerated course, to get into all the steps, or maybe it's a good thing, right? Because this always confused me when I was learning this for the first time. Cellular respiration will take place inside of the mitochondrial matrix. It's a really cool process, very long process with a lot of inputs and outputs. But again, we won't have time to go into all of those things. So, which organisms perform cellular respiration? Basically, it's all the organisms with mitochondria, which are going to be eukaryotes, right? Both autotrophs and heterotrophs, producers and consumers, they have mitochondria, right? Plants have mitochondria and chloroplasts. We only have mitochondria. Remember, even producers need to use ATP to grow, develop, and reproduce, right? So don't think again that just because they're green, they don't have mitochondria. They also need mitochondria, right? And again, we've learned to adapt, we've evolved to get our sugars by eating either plants or animals that have already in that sugar. Right, and here you just see the inefficiency of the whole thing, right? 100%, 10%, 1%, 0.1%. And this is something that you may see in a STAAR exam if you are in the state of Texas. So organisms who eat, they're just called heterotrophs, or I should say, we are just called heterotrophs, right? Organisms who cannot make their own food, so we cannot use the sunlight to create glucose. So we have to eat other organisms, whether that's plant or animals. That is what a consumer or a heterotroph is. And so here you go. Here's this kind of wrap up little slide right here with this little image. It's photosynthesis and cellular respiration are vital chemical reactions. And what's really cool is how they've evolved to work together, right? It's a cycle. It harnesses a sun's light energy right here. And again, this is the input to photosynthesis. The input is light energy, CO2, and water. And what comes out of that, which is beneficial to us, is this glucose and this oxygen. Right, but because when the chloroplast releases that, the mitochondria can take these things in. So the mitochondria takes in oxygen. And remember, this is what we have, this mitochondria. And so we breathe in oxygen and we eat glucose. We breathe out CO2 and we release water. Right. And so what's really cool is just, again, how when one is an output, sorry, one is being released as an output, the other one is taking it in as an input. And so this is kind of that cycle that happens there. Again, working together to harness the sun's light energy into chemical energy, which is a glucose, for use by living organisms, all the while recycling carbon dioxide and oxygen. And so that's what's cool about this oxygen, y'all. If you ever see oxygen O2, that is the kind that we breathe. We do not breathe just a single oxygen by itself. We couldn't breathe that in. We breathe in this O2. So again, be very thankful for the plants that you have around you. I love plants. I love gardening and surrounding myself with like green trees, plants, whatever it is, right? It's such a cool, or there's such cool organisms to share the earth with. And so, yeah, this is photosynthesis and cellular respiration.